now go to Paul Bridge. So Civitas social housing has created one of the largest portfolios of care-based housing and healthcare facilities in the UK. It's been constructed through a series of 120 individual transactions, and the covenant and the income on these assets are particularly attractive to investors. It's got a market cap about £700 million, and we're fortunate today to have, as I say, Paul Bridge, who's both a founder and CEO of Civitas. Paul, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see the presentation on your screen. I've got a number of slides to present to you today, but don't worry, the number of slides in the pack doesn't represent how long my presentation will be. Some of those slides are just for information. A little bit about my background. As Marcus said, I'm the founder and chief executive of Civitas, along with two other founders, and my background is social and healthcare housing. A little introduction to Civitas. We are now the market leader dedicated to investing in care-based housing facilities in the UK. We IPO'd in November 2016 and have done 2 equity raises, raising over £650 million of equity. All our properties provide lifelong residencies for people who are suffering from learning disabilities, autism or mental health issues. And the wider helicopter view to the British social housing system is that as we sit here today, around 4 million people are waiting for social homes. Obviously that need will never be met. And there's a desperate need for responsible institutional capital in this particular space. On page 4 and in the next few slides, we indicate some of the types of properties that we acquire. And we now have nearly 700 of these properties across the country. Each and every property is bespoke for residents living in them, and the life expectancy of residents living in these properties are likely to be as good as yours or mine. Turning to our rent roll is nearly at £50 million a year now, and you can see that we're paying dividends of around 5.3. The investment property of an IFRS valuation is now at nearly 900 million as of March 20, and our LTV level is at 27%. Some highlights about Civitas and the market and the portfolio. As I said, we believe that we have got the largest portfolio of care-based housing for adults of working age in the UK. We're a leading strategic counterparty for many major sector participants, including local authorities, housing associations, care providers, and the NHS. And I'll describe later how resilient this portfolio has been to the COVID pandemic. Some graphs ahead of you on pages 9 onwards describe the 6% growth in our annualised net rent roll and our 41% increase in operating cash flows, 28% growth in EPRA earnings, and our 6% growth in our IFRS valuation. As you can see on this slide here, we've made dividends consistently throughout the lifespan of the organisation, and the target dividend for 2021 is at 5.4p. The dividend cover is now at 100% as of 31st of March 2020, and that was up from 87.4% before that. Some operational highlights around Civitas, what we've done in the last year. Although this is social housing, providing housing for those with care needs, what's absolutely critical is that you understand the care that is going on in the buildings. That's not to say that we're operationally responsible for the care, because we're not. That's provided by professional care providers. But we now have extensive relationship with care providers across the UK, which gives us a sector and market leading advantage in both acquiring quality portfolios, but also in understanding that these properties are going to provide long-term accommodation. I'll touch on this more later. We've also been delivering some new state-of-the-art healthcare facilities, which I'll talk through shortly. We've established a social housing family CIC, partly to address some of the concerns raised by the regulator of social housing. And we've recently had shareholder consent to extend our mandate to work with new counterparties. In terms of our broader care provider relationships, as you can see in the graph on the right-hand side, we now have long-term strategic relationships with some of the largest healthcare providers in the UK. That's enabled us to back a third of the portfolio with 25-year back-to-back care provider leases, which gives additional protection to the housing associations, which also have back-to-back leases to us for 100% of our properties. The facility shown here is one of the state-of-the-art facilities I was mentioning earlier in Wales. This actually was commissioned and completed 2 weeks ago. We don't buy buildings, we don't take development risk on buildings, but we buy as exit. This is specified by the NHS and the local authority. It's a high quality 16-bed facility for mental health, autism and learning disability. And on the next page, page 16, you've got a new facility that will come on in the next few months, which is for 49 people. And you can see the bespoke nature of the facilities that have been provided there, which are simply some of the best facilities in the country. The Social Housing Family Community Interest Company, which we sponsored the setup of last year, it's chaired by myself, but it is independent from Civitas, both operationally and legally. The purpose of the CIC is to raise standards amongst housing associations in the sector, especially among specially supported living providers. It provides access to senior level management skills and resources, enables those housing associations to target the objectives set by the regulator, and enables in due course for CIC members to develop their own properties, thereby strengthening their balance sheets and growing their reserves. The first housing association to join was Auckland Housing Association back last year, and since then there have been a number of achievements that Auckland has been able to do in partnership with the Social Housing Family CIC, which include recruitment of several significant industry figures, both from housing and care, and also a number of new board members with significant financial and housing experience. They've also been able to safely increase their size from 500 homes to 800 homes. Turning to the widening relationship that we're developing with counterparties and regulators, the reason that we are shareholders to extend the mandate was because we've had extensive discussions with local authorities, with the NHS, with charities and other companies to extend the mandate and to provide housing through their management. If we're successful in signing some of those leases, it will mean that we have a plurality of regulation, and it means that the Charities Commission, the Care Quality Commission, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the regulator of social housing will all be regulators for some of those entities. And we felt it was important now to get that mandate changed, because obviously we won't be able to progress those conversations without having the permission of shareholders, which we've now achieved. The key characteristics of the Civitas portfolio: so 100% of the portfolio is let under long-term lease commitments. 2/3 of the portfolio is well-located community properties like the pictures I showed you earlier, and more than 1/3 of the portfolio is the higher acuity properties that I showed you in Wales, which comprise new purpose-built or repurposed properties. We have very limited uncovered voids. What we mean by uncovered voids is where the housing association is liable to pay for them. It's less than 3%. Care providers cover the void obligations of those housing associations. And we now house nearly 4,500 people with an average lease length remaining of 23.7 years. On the next slide, we look at our track record of successful capital deployment. And as mentioned in the introduction, we have carried out over 125 transactions. That sounds an enormous number. It certainly is. The reason for that is it's important every single building meets the needs of the local authority, is in the right geographic area, is of the right quality. And as we sit here today, there simply isn't large portfolios of these properties available, because many of them need to be brought on stream. And obviously that means that we now have potentially a portfolio effect over the nearly 700 buildings that we own. We've managed to achieve good yields of around 5.9%, which has contributed to our strong and consistent annualised rent roll growth. Importantly, in respect to capital deployment, it's obviously vital that robust due diligence is carried out. And as a consequence of that, we've rejected over 400 million of transactions. The primary reason for rejecting transactions is the level of rents, where properties are over-rented, or properties are in the wrong place, or the property condition is not good enough. What is absolutely fundamental, given that this income is 100% state-backed, is that we show that it's good value for money. So the rents that are being charged here are slightly higher than social housing rents, and that's been set in law over 2 decades ago. The reason that this rent regime was set up was because several decades ago, governments of all political persuasions decided that people with a learning disability, mental health or autism should not be living in institutions or in the NHS. Unfortunately, there are still people living in those conditions, which is what is creating the additional demand. In addition to the demand created by, thankfully, the improvement in life expectancy, is also better postnatal baby care in the last 3 decades, which has meant that increasingly a larger number of people are reaching adulthood and beyond, which simply wouldn't have done 30 years ago. So the Rent Standard 2020 confirms by the regulator that specially supported living is exempt. And because, as we've demonstrated, our properties tend to be mid and higher acuity, what we feel is that amply demonstrates that these rents are applicable and exempt. And we help our housing associations to demonstrate that to the regulator when they're engaging with the regulator. In respect to the pandemic, we've had no interruptions whatsoever in rents collected or rents paid. Our rent collection figures are just over 99.5%. All of the income is paid by the state. One of the reasons why the level of infection within the properties has been so low is, first of all, as I mentioned, the people living in the properties tend to be young, so they don't necessarily have physical underlying health conditions. They do have learning disabilities and mental health issues, but that doesn't affect their resistance to infection. Secondly, the nature of the care that's being carried out here is very distinct from elderly care. So in fact, the CQC, the regulator of care, produced some figures in the last few weeks that showed that the total number of deaths within all of specially supported living, which it probably comprises 150,000 people, has been in the low hundreds. Obviously that compares with, very sadly, with care homes, where the figures have been tens of thousands. And the reason for that is the one-to-one care that's been provided means that a care worker is dedicated to a particular building and often to a particular residence, often providing care that's over 40 or 50 hours a week. In addition, these care providers have been well supported by local authorities in terms of payments for additional PPE and other additional staff-related costs. And Civitas has been able to play its part in addressing homelessness through the pandemic. As you may be aware, the government in the UK ordered all local authorities to rehouse all rough sleepers immediately, overnight. The majority of that was carried out via hotel accommodation, but we were able to provide a newly refurbished block of flats to Islington Council, which will further add to our reputation, we believe, in the sector. What's absolutely fundamental to us, and has always been at the heart of Civitas in terms of how we invest in this sector, because it is a social sector, is that we demonstrate very strong social impact. We test ourselves thoroughly on this independently once every 6 months with the assistance of the Good Economy Partnership. And in addition, in the last year, we brought on board the Social Profit Calculator, who aid governments in assessing the social value created by particular investments. And what it's shown is some substantial figures that actually directly the Civitas portfolio saves over £65 million a year to local and national governments. That's the differential between the cost of someone living in an institutional care setting or living in special supported living. And that 114 million of social value has been generated. And of course, both those figures increase as the portfolio increases. What social value is defined as is we did a sector leading with the social profit calculator, series of interviews with 150 people with learning disabilities and their families. And what that demonstrated is that there are many other additional costs that can be shown to be generated by moving into proper supported housing. To give one example, because many young adults were living hundreds of miles away from their parents or from their children and friends, travel costs are included in that figure. The most egregious example I came across recently was an 82-year-old woman who was having to fly from Belfast to Doncaster once a month to visit her son in hospital. He's now thankfully been relocated back in Belfast, but of course the costs of that were all met by the state. We've got a slide here about our financial industry and care sector awards. We merely highlight these to demonstrate that we believe we're right at the heart of healthcare housing in the UK. Now we were the largest single investor in healthcare UK housing in the last year. We've got a significant pipeline of opportunities coming up, and you can see an estimated value of 200 million there. And we're very well positioned for sustainable growth through our extensive relationships with care providers, taking higher acuity properties, working with the social housing family CIC to improve standards in the sector, working to expand our base in terms of working with different counterparties, and extending our geographic reach. So we now have a mandate to work in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and we are assessing opportunities in those areas at the moment. So finally, we believe we've created a robust and diversified mid to higher acuity portfolio to underpin long-term income and capital growth whilst delivering social impact and social value. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to try to group these questions into, I think, 3 parts. The first set of questions are around the regulatory environment and issues with other parts of the market and how that impacts your opportunity. I'd then like to go on and talk about the size of the market, your market share, and how you scale your balance sheet, not in the next 2 or 3 years, but over the longer term. And then I have a question about the value of your shares. And the question basically, which you might like to start with, is, as the share price is more than the net asset value, how do you create value for shareholders?
Okay.
How much are you planning to raise the dividend going forward, and what other ways are you looking to increase shareholder value? So you might want to start with that one and then go back into the other 2 aspects, which are more structural.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously some of this will be estimated, but as you saw in the presentation, the projected dividend for the coming year is 5.4p. In terms of additional value, where that potentially comes is in the aggregation value of this portfolio, because clearly with 125 transactions, the smallest being 300,000, I mean the largest being 80 million, you know, JLL do attribute an additional value through portfolio. And we do tend to show IFRS now at the request of shareholders. I mean, the key purpose of this fund is to deliver long-term consistent income on a very safe basis with low levels of debt, and you know that actually it will be able to, you know, we call ourselves an evergreen fund. That's really important for the counterparties that we work with, because the need for this housing is lifelong and likely to be multi-decade. So what we're aiming for is providing consistent dividend and hopefully growth, but certainly consistent dividend payments, you know, throughout the life of the fund. I think you're on mute, Richard.
Would you like to address the regulatory environment, what was happening last year, and talk about the difficulty of trying to navigate your way through the regulatory environment going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly all these housing associations are regulated by the regulator for social housing. They have one duty, which is to, I mean, and obviously I can't speak on behalf of the regulator, but their one duty is to oversee standards in that sector. They don't have a locus for investment, and they don't have a locus for anything else in respect of the duties of those housing associations. Actually, some years ago, the regulator would have had a joint role, firstly to inspect standards, but secondly to promote investment. Those responsibilities are now split between Homes England, which is essentially the government's investor, and the regulator of social housing, which is essentially around standards. Now, the regulator of social housing has been quite clear that it absolutely sees there's enormous demand for this type of property. They've spoken to local authorities themselves, they've spoken to the CQC. It's absolutely clear that demand is very, very high. It's estimated that for every bed space we have, there are eight more people waiting for it. You can see in the wider material that we've provided that there have been a number of government statements and reaffirmations from all political parties of the need for specially supported living. And this is not unique to the UK, it's a Western European phenomenon. People have all agreed this needs to happen. What is quite clear is where the regulator is engaging with smaller housing associations. The average size of a housing association managing specially supported living is under 1,000 homes. And there's a simple reason for that, which is they've never received any government grants, and specially supported living has been only provided for the last 25 years. So they're all less than that. So when they become over 1,000 homes, the regulator will carry out an in-depth assessment and will make recommendations and will publish those recommendations for improvements to be made. Sometimes those recommendations that are made have already been implemented, and normally they're around operational and governance issues. There is to be absolutely candid, there's a wider point that the regulator has around the dependency of each housing association on state-backed income. You could argue that that is similar for other big general needs housing associations, except that they have the additional risk of development and of creating housing for sale to subsidise social housing. We personally have an excellent relationship with the regulator. We talk to them regularly. The Social Housing Family CIC that we set up talks to them regularly. We're not regulated by them. And we will diversify who we're working with. That was part of the purpose of the extension of the investor mandate by shareholders. So we will work with unregistered housing associations and other charities and other bodies to diversify some of the risk around that.
Okay, could you just expand on the practical benefits of having bespoke facilities? How much more efficient?
Well, in terms of bespoke facilities, so I mean, as you'll see from a lot of the pictures, in terms of the buildings that are in the community, they look like a building that any one of us might live in. It's inside the building where the bespoke nature takes place, you know, in terms of particular facilities, in terms of particular, you know, you might have heat sensors, you might have, you know, automatic lighting, you might have lighting that's appropriate for those people with autism, you might have sensory rooms, you know, a whole series of things. And the reason that those things are important is because when the local authority is specifying that they want Paul, say, to live in a particular property with a particular condition, those bespoke facilities need to be provided for Paul, because Paul is likely to be 25 years old and live there for 50 years. So it's absolutely critical that he gets the facilities that he needs.
There's a question here. Is your model applicable internationally? I'm sure you've got enough to do in the UK, but it was just a question that's just come in.
I think it is, yeah. And we've travelled a little bit in Europe, talking to people about what they're doing. As I said earlier, there is this type of housing in Germany and Scandinavia and various other European countries. So yes, absolutely, I think it is possible. There are, we've had discussions with care providers in Sweden who wanted to come into the UK. It's interesting because I hate to quote numbers like this because they may be inaccurate, but the care industry itself in this sector is remarkably disaggregated. So it's estimated there's 22,000 companies providing care. Some of that is obviously companies in different, you know, under different names, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of aggregation to come there. A lot of the bigger providers are starting to aggregate companies together and there's a lot of interest internationally in that as well.
Got a slightly technical question. What was the significance of emerging from the COVID-19 blanket material uncertainty clause that was mandated by RICS?
Well, that clause has been lifted now.
Oh, yes, it has been. But the significance to you is, what does it actually mean for investors? What does it mean in terms of the implications for you?
Well, at the time of the pandemic, there was no, with our independent valuers, JLL, there was no sense that there was going to be any effect on the valuation at all. And of course, as you know, and as we've demonstrated, there's been no operational interruption and there's been no loss of rental income. In some cases, that has actually got quicker because the state wants to make sure that it is paying its bills to keep people in the properties. But obviously, as you know, Richard, that material uncertainty clause has now been lifted.
Yeah, so I just wanted, for clarity, somebody was just asking that question. I've got a final question for you, which is, can you help me understand what the care provider gets out of the involvement in the equation between yourself, the housing association, and just put that into the are they able to make money? Are they solidly based?
Yeah.
That's really what we're asking, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Where this started really 25 years ago was that care providers, local authorities and the regulator at the time felt that having a care provider owning the building that you can see in front of you on the slide, plus managing it, created risks for people living there. The risks that people felt it created was that if the care started to fail, then the care provider could say, even if the local authority and regulator intervene, the care provider could say, well, actually, we own this property and we're going to take our keys with us, in the most extreme example. Secondly, the fees that we're talking about here are several £1,000s a week. They can go up to £5,000 a week. And even though that sounds very, very high, it's about 50% less than the cost of providing equivalent care in a large institution. And even if it wasn't significantly less, obviously the outcomes for residents are much better. We see a lot of media at the moment quite regularly about people, particularly young people, still stuck in institutions and in hospitals, and they need high quality facilities like this. So the care providers also, many care providers own their own properties. Some of them are charitable, some of them are private entities. National Care Group that I mentioned earlier, that we work with a lot, are one of the largest privately owned care operators in the UK of specialist supported housing. And in many cases, the newer care providers don't want to tie up capital in acquiring assets. They also, and where they do hold assets, they sometimes want to release that capital so they can expand their services, or to deal with the aggregation point so that they can acquire other companies. So if you look at Lifeways, Britain's biggest care provider, that's an amalgam of probably 40 companies that were bought over the last 20 years. And they were able to achieve that by obviously deleveraging and selling property and leasing it back. So the fees are very robust. Interestingly, if you take the building in front of you, the rent payable to us might be £200 a week per person, indexed, but the care fees, as I say, will start at £2,000 a week. So you can see there's a significant margin for the care provider.
Thank you. I've got one final question for you. Is Civitas planning to increase its scope to start investing in supported housing for individuals with lower support needs, victims of domestic violence, substance abuse, misuse, etc.?
Yeah, we already provide, some of the portfolio already provides accommodation for ex-offenders, for people who have had addictions, for people who require other support. And we do have a couple of buildings where people have been fleeing domestic violence. Yes, so there's a range of different types of support that can be provided. Obviously, that needs to be provided by a professional care provider. I'm not going to say the accommodation's easy because it's really difficult, but even more important than the accommodation and getting that right is making sure that the long-term support for people moving in is there. Because if the support isn't there, then they're unlikely to thrive in the community homes that we're providing.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have another poll. You've got about a minute. Please remember to scroll down, and then we'll continue with the next presentation. Thank you very much.